There is a moment very fabric of existence. To live is to want, and to want is to suffer. Even moments of happiness are merely the temporary absence of pain, quickly replaced by boredom or new forms of distress. The world, he wrote, is hell, and men are on the one hand the tormented souls, and on the other the devils. His ideas were radical, even scandalous. In an era obsessed with progress, Schopenhauer declared that existence itself was a mistake, a curse passed from one generation to the next. He rejected the comforting myths of religion and the triumphalism of reason. Instead, he offered a stark, uncompromising vision. To be alive is to be condemned to suffer, and the only true escape is to refuse the call of the will altogether. To step into Schopenhauer's shadow is to see the world stripped of its illusions, to feel the weight of existence pressing down, and to ask, perhaps for the first time, whether life is truly a gift or a burden we are forced to bear. If Schopenhauer's life was a study in suffering, his philosophy was a challenge to the very act of creation. He did not simply mourn the pain of existence. He questioned the morality of bringing new life into a world so defined by anguish. This is the heart of antinatalism, the radical idea that to create is not always to bless, and that sometimes the greatest kindness is to refrain. Imagine, for a moment, a thought experiment. You stand before two doors. Behind one, there is nothing, no consciousness, no pain, no joy, no loss. Behind the other, there is life, a tapestry of fleeting pleasures, but also heartbreak, illness, disappointment, and the certainty of death. If you could choose for someone else, someone who does not yet exist, which door would you open? Would you risk exposing them to the inevitable suffering of life, or would you spare them entirely? Schopenhauer's answer was clear. He saw the will to life as a blind force, compelling us to reproduce without reason, to drag new beings into a world they never asked to enter. For him, procreation was not a neutral act, but a moral gamble, one in which the odds are stacked against happiness. Every child, he argued, is born into a world of struggle, destined to chase desires that can never be fully satisfied. The pleasures of life are brief and fragile. The pains are deep and enduring. But Schopenhauer's argument did not end with him. Nearly 2 centuries later, philosopher David Benatar would sharpen the blade of antinatalism with a new, unsettling logic. Benatar's asymmetry argument asks us to weigh pain and pleasure not as equals, but as fundamentally different in moral weight. The absence of pain, he suggests, is always good, even if no one benefits from it. The absence of pleasure, on the other hand, is not bad, unless someone is deprived of it. In other words, not being born means missing out on pleasure, but also means being spared all suffering. And since the unborn cannot regret their non-existence, there is no harm in never having lived. This logic is as simple as it is disturbing. If suffering is inevitable, and if the absence of suffering is always preferable to its presence, then bringing a child into the world is to expose them to harm for the sake of potential, uncertain joys. Is any amount of happiness enough to justify a single moment of agony? Is it right to gamble with another's fate, knowing the risks? Antinatalism does not deny that life contains beauty, love, and wonder. It does not claim that all existence is misery, but it asks us to look honestly at the balance sheet, to count not just the moments of joy, but the years of anxiety, the shadow of loss, the certainty of death. It asks us to consider whether the pleasures of life are ever enough to outweigh its pains, or whether, in the end, non-existence is the only true escape from suffering. These are not questions with easy answers. They unsettle, provoke, and linger long after the conversation ends. To embrace antinatalism is not to hate life, but to recognize its cost, and to wonder, with Schopenhauer and Benatar, whether the price is ever worth paying. In the end, the logic of antinatalism is not a call to despair, but a challenge to our deepest assumptions. It asks us to confront the uncomfortable truth that creation is not always kindness, and that sometimes the greatest act of compassion is to choose not to create at all. If the logic of antinatalism unsettles us, it is because it collides head-on with something ancient and powerful within us, the urge to create, to continue, to leave a mark on the world. For most, the desire to have children feels less like a choice and more like a calling, a force as natural as hunger or thirst. But where does this force come from? And why does it so often go unquestioned? At the most basic level, the drive to reproduce is written into our biology. Evolution has shaped us to crave connection, to seek intimacy, to protect and nurture our offspring. The survival of our genes depends on it. For millennia, those who felt the pull of parenthood were the ones who passed on their lineage, while those who did not simply faded from the story. The result is a species hardwired to see children not just as a possibility, but as a necessity. But biology is only the beginning. Layered atop our instincts are the stories we tell ourselves, stories of family, of legacy, of meaning. From the earliest myths to the latest Hollywood films, parenthood is cast as the ultimate fulfillment, the final chapter in the journey of adulthood. To have a child is to achieve something sacred, to become part of a chain stretching back through time. It is no accident that so many cultures revere ancestors, celebrate fertility, and mourn childlessness as a tragedy. Religion, too, has played its part. In many faiths, procreation is not just encouraged, but commanded. Be fruitful and multiply, the ancient texts declare, turning reproduction into a moral duty. To refuse is to defy the will of God, to break the cycle of creation. Even in secular societies, echoes of this commandment linger, shaping laws, customs, and expectations. Yet beneath these grand narratives, subtler forces are at work. Societies depend on new generations to sustain economies, care for the old, and defend against threats. Governments and institutions have long promoted parenthood, sometimes through gentle persuasion, sometimes through outright propaganda. Posters, advertisements, and public policies all whisper the same message. To have children is to be normal, responsible, complete. But what if these messages are not just encouragements, but manipulations? What if the pressure to reproduce is less about individual fulfillment and more about serving the needs of society? The question is uncomfortable, but it lingers in the background, challenging the stories we have always believed. On a personal level, the psychology of procreation is tangled with hope and denial. We imagine that our children will be happy, that their lives will be better than our own. We downplay the risks, rationalize the hardships, and focus on the moments of joy. The pain of existence is minimized, tucked away behind dreams of family vacations, graduations, and weddings. We tell ourselves that suffering is just a part of life, that it can be overcome, that love will make it all worthwhile. But is this hope a form of courage or a kind of blindness? Are we choosing to see only what we want to see, ignoring the darker truths that Schopenhauer and the antinatalists force us to confront? The mechanisms of denial and rationalization are powerful, allowing us to move forward without being paralyzed by doubt. Yet, they also shield us from the full reality of what it means to bring a new life into the world. To question the psychology of procreation is to peel back layers of instinct, tradition, and propaganda. It is to ask not just whether we should have children, but why we want to in the first place. And in that question lies a deeper challenge, to see ourselves and our choices with unflinching honesty. If the logic of antinatalism is so compelling, why does it remain hidden in the shadows, rarely discussed, often dismissed, and almost always met with discomfort or hostility? The answer lies not just in personal psychology, but in the deep structures of society itself. Throughout history, the survival and success of civilizations have depended on one simple fact: people must keep being born. Population growth has been the engine of empires, the source of armies, the foundation of economies. In ancient Rome, laws rewarded large families and punished those who remained childless. In medieval Europe, the Church condemned those who refused to marry and procreate. Even today, nations compete to boost birth rates, fearing the specter of demographic decline. The reasons are not hard to find. More people mean more workers, more consumers, more soldiers. A growing population fuels economic expansion, supports aging generations, and projects power on the world stage. The interests of the state, the market, and the family are all aligned in a single direction, toward more births, more bodies, more lives. But this dependence comes at a cost. To question the value of procreation is to threaten the very foundations of society. And so, antinatalist ideas are not just ignored, they are actively suppressed. The media rarely gives voice to those who doubt the wisdom of having children. Education systems teach the importance of family, but rarely the ethics of birth. Government policies, from tax breaks to parental leave, encourage reproduction, while those who choose not to have children are often met with suspicion or pity. This silence is not accidental. It is a form of social control, a way of keeping uncomfortable questions at bay. To speak openly about antinatalism is to risk being labeled selfish, nihilistic, or even dangerous. Philosophers who have dared to challenge the pronatalist consensus, like Schopenhauer, Benatar, or the ancient Gnostics, have often been marginalized, their ideas dismissed as fringe or pathological. Ordinary people who choose to remain child-free are told they will regret it, that they are shirking their duty, that they are missing out on the true meaning of life. Yet, beneath the surface, the taboo persists because it strikes at something deeper than economics or politics. It forces us to confront the possibility that our most cherished values, family, legacy, continuity, may be built on a foundation of suffering. It asks us to consider who benefits from our silence and who pays the price for our unquestioned obedience. What are we afraid of when we refuse to discuss antinatalism? Is it the collapse of society or the collapse of our illusions? Is it the fear of loneliness or the fear of meaninglessness? Or is it simply the terror of looking too closely at the world we have created and the lives we continue to bring into it? In the end, the taboo of antinatalism is not just a social blind spot. It is a mirror reflecting our deepest anxieties and our most unexamined beliefs. And until we are willing to look into that mirror, the question will remain haunting and unresolved. The world Schopenhauer inhabited was one of candlelight and carriages, of wars fought with muskets and empires built on steam. Yet, nearly 2 centuries later, his shadow stretches further than ever, cast not just over philosophy, but over the anxieties of our own age. Today, the question of whether to bring new life into the world is no longer a distant abstraction. It is a dilemma that haunts dinner tables, online forums, and the private thoughts of millions. In the 21st century, the logic of antinatalism has found new fuel in the crises that define our era. Climate change, once a distant threat, now shapes the daily news. Wildfires, floods, heat waves, and vanishing species. Scientists warn of a future where food and water grow scarce, where entire regions become uninhabitable, where the very stability of civilization is at risk. Against this backdrop, a growing number of people are asking, is it ethical to bring a child into a world on the brink? The question is no longer confined to philosophers and academics. It echoes in the voices of young couples, activists, and public figures. Movements like Birth Strike have emerged, with individuals publicly declaring their refusal to have children as a form of protest against environmental destruction. Online, hashtags like #ChildFreeByChoice and #StopHavingKids trend alongside stories of ecological grief and existential dread. For many, the decision not to procreate is not just personal. It is political, a statement of resistance against a system that demands endless growth at any cost. But the anxieties of the present go beyond the environment. Overpopulation, once a specter of the 20th century, has returned to the conversation. The world population has soared past 8 billion, straining resources, fueling inequality, and intensifying competition for land, water, and opportunity. In some countries, the pressure to have children is matched by a growing sense of unease. Will there be enough for everyone? What kind of future are we creating for the next generation? Existential risk, too, looms larger than ever. Advances in technology have brought new dangers, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, pandemics, that threaten not just individuals, but the very survival of humanity. In this context, the act of bringing a child into the world can feel like a gamble with stakes too high to bear. Yet, for all its urgency, the modern antinatalist movement is not a monolith. It is a tapestry of voices, each with their own reasons and fears. Some are motivated by compassion, unwilling to expose a child to suffering. Others are driven by anger at a world they see as broken beyond repair. Still others are simply choosing a different path, seeking meaning outside the traditional roles of parenthood. The debates rage online, in comment sections and podcasts, in essays and viral videos. Some argue that refusing to have children is an act of despair, a surrender to hopelessness. Others see it as a form of radical empathy, a refusal to perpetuate harm. The arguments are fierce, the emotions raw, the stakes impossibly high. What is clear is that Schopenhauer's pessimism has found new life in the 21st century. His vision of existence as suffering resonates with a generation facing unprecedented uncertainty. The old certainties of progress, of abundance, of a better tomorrow have been shaken. In their place is a new kind of questioning, a willingness to confront the possibility that the most ethical choice may be not to create, but to pause, to reflect, to refuse. In this way, the logic of antinatalism is no longer a relic of the past. It is a living, breathing debate, one that challenges us to rethink not just the future of humanity, but the very meaning of hope, responsibility, and love in a world on the edge. To confront the darkness of antinatalism is to stand at the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of suffering and doubt. But not everyone who peers into that abyss turns away from life. For every argument against procreation, there are voices, quiet and defiant, that insist on the possibility of joy, the creation of meaning, and the resilience of the human spirit. Critics of antinatalism do not deny the reality of suffering. They have felt it, lived it, and in many cases been shaped by it. But they argue that pain is not the whole story. Life, they say, is not a ledger of pleasure and pain, but a tapestry woven from both. To be alive is to experience not just loss and longing, but also wonder, connection, and love. Consider the stories of parents who, despite hardship, speak of moments that make everything worthwhile. A child's laughter, a shared sunrise, the quiet pride of watching someone you love grow into themselves. These are not illusions, but real experiences, flashes of meaning that can illuminate even the darkest days. For many, the act of creating life is an act of hope, a leap of faith that tomorrow can be better than today. Philosophers, too, have challenged the antinatalist view. Existentialists like Albert Camus and Viktor Frankl argue that meaning is not given, but made. Suffering, they claim, is not a reason to despair, but a call to create purpose in the face of adversity. Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust, wrote that those who have a why to live can bear almost anyhow. For him, the value of life was not in its comfort, but in its capacity for meaning, even and especially in the midst of suffering. There is also the argument that hope is not mere denial, but a form of rebellion. To bring a child into the world is to assert, against all odds, that life is worth living. It is to believe that beauty can emerge from pain, that love can outlast loss, that the future is not yet written. This hope is not naive, but courageous, a refusal to let suffering have the final word. Yet, the paradox remains. Can the value of life truly outweigh its pain? Is it right to gamble on happiness, knowing the risks? Or is hope itself a necessary illusion, a story we tell to keep moving forward? There are no easy answers. But in wrestling with these questions, we are forced to confront the full complexity of existence, the darkness and the light, the despair and the hope. And perhaps, in that struggle, we find not certainty, but a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. We began with a cry, a newborn's first breath, the trembling hope of parents, the silent question that lingers in the air. Now, As the echoes of suffering and hope fade, we return to the tension that has haunted every moment of this journey, the weight of existence and the responsibility of choice. To question the act of creation is to challenge the very core of what it means to be human. It is to stand apart from the crowd, to resist the comforting stories we tell ourselves about family, legacy, and love. It is to look unflinchingly at the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, and to ask, what do we owe to those who do not yet exist? Is it our duty to give them life, or to spare them from suffering? This is not a question with a simple answer. It is a question that demands courage, the courage to doubt, to reflect, to accept uncertainty. It is the courage to see that the world is not divided into easy categories of good and evil, joy and pain, but is instead a tangled web of both. It is the courage to recognize that every act of creation is also an act of risk, and that every choice carries consequences we cannot foresee. Perhaps, in the end, the true value of antinatalism is not in its answers, but in its questions. It forces us to confront the reality of suffering, to weigh the meaning of hope, and to see the act of bringing life into the world as a profound moral decision, not a given, but a choice. As we close, the question remains unresolved and haunting. If existence is suffering, what do we owe to the unborn? In the silence that follows, we are left to sit with our discomfort, to think deeply, and perhaps to see the world and ourselves with new eyes. Let me know if you need any revisions or if you'd like to add anything further.